Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast where we explore how recent discoveries in neuroscience are unraveling the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 170, which is scheduled to be released on March 27th, 2020. Since I started this show in 2006, I've always strove to create evergreen content. But given the current coronavirus pandemic, I have decided to mention the date to provide context for future listeners. I have created a pre-roll announcement encouraging you to listen to the podcast This Week in Virology if you're looking for accurate information from scientists who actually work in the field. Otherwise, unless necessary, I intend to make this podcast a virus-free zone, since I assume many of you are listening to get a break from the pandemic. Brain Science is independently produced and relies on listeners like you for financial support. You can find complete episode show notes and transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com. You can send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Submit voicemail at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis, or post to the Brain Science Podcast fan page on Facebook. Today's guest is Andreas Nieder, author of a fascinating book called A Brain for Numbers, The Biology of the Number Instinct. I'll be back after the interview to review the key ideas and to share a few brief announcements, including an update on my upcoming book release and an announcement about the schedule for the rest of 2020. Andreas, thanks so much for coming on Brain Science today.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Ginger. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So before we talk about your fascinating book, A Brain for Numbers, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and focus on how you got interested in neuroscience?
Mm-hmm. So I studied biology with a major in zoology, so neuroscience wasn't that far away. And I knew then pretty quickly that I wanted to become a neurobiologist. And initially I worked with birds. So my undergraduate and graduate studies was about the brain and behavior of birds. So first I studied the neuronal hearing mechanisms in European starlings, and then did my PhD about visual neuroscience in behaving barn owls. That was a great time and I enjoyed it very much. But at the end of my PhD, I had the urge to leave sensory neuroscience behind and do more cognitive neuroscience. And also I wanted to switch to a species that was closer to humans. And obviously that's non-human primates or monkeys. At the end of my PhD, I came across this very fascinating, for me anyway, topic of numerical competence, which means the question how we or animals in our brains are representing the number of objects in a set. That's often called numerosity. And the reason for this choice were two major influences. One was the fascinating work by the zoologist Otto Köhler. Otto Köhler was a German ethologist who mainly worked with birds, and I had a bird socialization, so I came across his studies. And he was actually the first who showed in the 30s and 40s of the last century that animals could discriminate the number of objects or the number of events. And unfortunately, because he wrote exclusively in German, his work is largely inaccessible and forgotten nowadays. But that wasn't a problem for me. And then at about this time, there was a seminal behavioral study by Elizabeth Brennan and Herbert Terrace at Columbia University in the renowned journal Science in 1998. And this paper showed in a uniquely controlled way that rhesus monkeys understood the concept of numerical quantity. And I thought if monkeys can crunch numbers and can think about and ponder about numbers, the only way they can do it is that their brains endows them with this skill. And I found out that hardly anything was known about how the brain would represent numbers. So this seemed to me a true scientific frontier worth investigating and spending my career. So at the end of my PhD, I approached Earl Miller in his laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge and asked him whether he would be interested to explore how the brain endows monkeys to process numbers. At that time, Earl was already a rising star in the field of primate cognitive neuroscience, had brilliant students gathered around him, had modern and very efficient scientific equipment. And I was very lucky that Earl invited me to join his laboratory in order to study neurons and how they may respond to numerical quantity. So from 2000 to 2003, I spent my postdoc work in Earl's lab, which was probably my most intense and most productive time. And it definitely determined my scientific career, because since then I made myself a living by exploring how neurons in different brains give rise to our sense of number. And certainly this book would not exist without my fruitful time abroad. And after the postdoc time in 2003, I returned to Germany. I was awarded a junior research group at the University of Tübingen, where I first worked in the medical department, where Peter Thier, the head of the cognitive neurology department, generously shared his monkey research infrastructure so that I could start my own lab. And finally, in 2008, I was appointed professor of animal physiology and director of the Institute of Neurobiology in the science faculty of the university. So I returned, if you like, to my home faculty as a biologist. And since then, I've been continuing the work with rhesus monkeys, but also complemented this line of research later with corvid songbirds, with crows. And most recently, I'm very excited about a collaboration with an epileptologist from the University of Bonn, which is Florian Moormann. This collaboration allows us now to even study how neurons in the human brain represent number. That's a very rare and great opportunity. So altogether, my career is basically based on understanding how electrical signals of single neurons and ensemble of neurons give rise to numerical competence, both in humans, but from a comparative point of view, also in primates and avian brains.
And as you have given us an overview of your field, the information that's in your book isn't very widely known. Even though I'm a big fan of Stanislas Dehaene, I haven't actually read The Number Sense. I've read all of his other books.
Yeah.
In fact, I just interviewed him for his new book. But that means that when I read your book, it was full of stuff I didn't know, which I really enjoyed.
Well, thank you very much.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of studying the neuroscience of numbers?
Yeah, I think like many other fields in neuroscience, it started with patient studies. Early in the last century, the exploration or investigation of patients that had brain damage and then selective losses of certain functions kicked off this entire field of neuroscience. And also in terms of numerical information, there were very influential early studies by Salomon Henschen, for instance, a Swedish neurologist who studied several patients who, based on brain damage in certain areas of the brain, all of a sudden were no longer able to process numbers or to calculate. And he coined this term acalculia, which means the inability to do calculations. Of course, at that time, beginning of last century, there was no imaging opportunity available. So many of the patients have not been studied, their brains, or only post-mortem. So where exactly these functions are represented in the brain was not very well understood, but it became clear that processing numbers is an independent faculty. And that's, I think, one of the main messages also of the book. Many people think that language endows us with the capability to process numbers and to do mathematics. But it turns out that this number sense and mathematical capabilities is really a separate system in the brain, and it has separate locations. And if these locations are damaged in any way, then people may selectively lose the ability to process numbers, but language may be spared. And later on, with the advent of functional imaging methods in the 90s, basically of the last century, more and more studies try to map out the brain and find out where in the brain this information is represented. And many of these studies are pointing towards the posterior parietal cortex and parts of the prefrontal cortex, which really became a reoccurring theme. So I guess these two areas in our brain are terribly important and are the core areas for processing numbers. Later then, so in around the turn of the millennium, a few single cell studies started to explore how single neurons, based on their electrical activity, would represent numerical information in animals. And yes, I guess I was happy enough to be one of these people. And that's why also this information is heavily conveyed in the book.
I'm going to sort of give a spoiler here and mention that in the book you explain that in essence we have two number systems, the one that we share with other animals and then the symbolic number system. And we'll go into that in more detail in a minute. But in studying animals, I remember the story of Clever Hans.
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you take us through that briefly, just to use it as an example of the kind of challenges you face if you're studying animals?
Right. Yes. One has to be very careful when studying animals because they may pick up lots of information, and not all of this information is actually the wanted kind of information that a researcher wants to investigate. So the story of Clever Hans is very illuminating because it shows all of these problems. So Clever Hans was a horse, a stallion, owned by a former soldier, German soldier, Wilhelm von Osten. And Wilhelm von Osten was convinced that Clever Hans was able to count and do mathematics. And he had even some shows around 1900 in Berlin where he, tried to convince the audience that the horse was able to count. So for instance, he would write down an equation on a chalkboard, like 2 + 3, and the horse then would tap exactly 5 times with its hoof and then stop very reliably, and also for much more complex mathematical calculations. And for a while, eminent scientists of the time were really convinced that the horse was able to do mathematics, until another psychologist, Oskar Pfungst, reinvestigated the entire case because he couldn't believe it. And he found out that the horse paid attention to subtle and unconscious body movements of anyone in the audience who knew the result of this calculation. So it may have been von Osten himself or even someone in the audience, because as soon as these people who knew the result of the calculation were removed from the horse failed. It was never found out what exactly the horse paid attention to. It might have been some muscle tensions or some changes of the breathing rhythm. There's also no evidence that von Osten tried to trick the audience into something. He seemed to be convinced, but it turned out that the horse was smart, but in a very different way. And this was one of the, if you like, catastrophes in cognitive science. And this effect, the Clever Hans effect, is now in any psychologist's textbook. And it tells us how important it is to remove anyone who could know something about the outcome of an experiment from animals, and of course also from humans, because all of these subjects may pay attention to social cues that we are unaware of.
And then when you're designing an experiment, there's other kinds of confounds that you have to worry about.
Yeah, particularly when working with numbers. So one of the prime stimulus to address the number sense is to show arrays of dots. And the problem then is if you increase the number of dots or the number of objects, also other factors, non-numerical factors, change. So for instance, if you have 2 dots of a certain size and you go from 2 dots to 4 dots, you also increase the area of blackness, for instance, if you have two black dots. And animals may detect this change in the black area rather than the change in the number. And this would, of course, be a confounding factor. And other things could change, such as the density of the dots or the arrangement and so on and so forth. And all of these aspects have to be taken care of and have to be controlled. That's very important for the presentation of sequential numerosities. So adding one dot after the other, if you like, or one object after the other. Time is usually a confounding factor because, for instance, it may take twice as long to present 4 objects compared to 2 objects. And here again, animals may become sensitive to time rather than to the number of objects.
Right. And I appreciated in your book that there's a lot of attention paid to this, and you explain in great detail how these various things are dealt with. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of this. So as we move forward, I'd like to discuss the difference between several different terms that you use in the book. You use the word numeracy and also arithmetic and mathematics. And I think in particular, the difference between arithmetic and mathematics might be important.
Mathematics is, of course, the big overarching term, and I am hesitant to say my book is about mathematics. That was also not in the title. Mathematics would be arithmetics and geometry together, basically. That's kind of the textbook understanding. And arithmetics would be dealing with numbers and calculating with numbers. So it is on the arithmetic side, but it is a very, very basic kind of arithmetic because it deals with the question, how are numerical quantities or cardinalities or numerosities, I'm using all of these as synonyms, represented in the brain. And then I try to say a few words about very basic calculation procedures such as addition or subtraction. So it is a very humble type of mathematics or arithmetics, if you like. The point I try to make in the book as a biologist is that there is more than doing the symbolic counting and calculation that we humans are so used to in our technologically and scientifically inspired society, but that there is reason to believe that this symbolic system, this counting system that we have to learn painfully, builds on an ancient estimation system, a system that allows us and animals and infants and newborns even to represent the number of objects in an approximate way, estimate the number of objects, but still understanding what a quantity, a numerical quantity means. And there is a lot of evidence, but also dispute about that this basic non-symbolic system is a blueprint or a starting point of what later emerges into a symbolic mathematical system. That's one of the aspects I try to work out in this book, this connection between this primordial non-symbolic system and the later symbolic system that only we adult humans are endowed with.
So let's take some examples of animals that have this non-symbolic approximate system. Would you talk a minute about honeybees?
Yeah, honeybees. Fascinating guys. You may wonder why honeybees. Honeybees are only very remotely related to us humans. They don't even have a backbone, so they are not even vertebrates. And the last common ancestor between bees as insects and us vertebrates and primates and humans lived about 600 million years ago. And since then, these two groups of animals, one leading to the bees and the other to the vertebrates and birds and mammals and primates, evolved completely independent. So bees have a very different brain organization with few but very complex neurons. But recent studies show that they too can discriminate the number of objects. For instance, in dot displays, but maybe more relevant for the bees, they are enumerating the number of landmarks when foraging, when navigating. So bees have this habit of flying out from the hive, looking for sources of nectar, and they fly several kilometers to find these flowers and nectar. And then they have to return. And of course, they have to orient in some way. And it seems that bees can orient by enumerating landmarks. At least that was shown in one study. And in another study, bees were trained to discriminate the number of black spots on a card. And even here they succeeded. And they could even succeed and could be trained, or actually not trained, they inferred the rule smaller than even for the empty set. So for no object, numerosity 0, which was a big thing 2 years ago and also published in this renowned journal Science.
Today's sponsor is Text Expander, which is an app that I literally use every day. Text Expander allows you to create snippets of any length, which can then be inserted to any app without any special plugins. You can find tutorials and webinars at textexpander.com. Text Expander is available for Mac OS, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad. Please visit textexpander.com/podcast to get 20% off your first year. That's textexpander.com/podcast. And don't forget to tell them that you heard about Text Expander on Brain Science. We don't have time to go into examples of all the different animals, but I do want to spend a minute talking about the corvids. You've been studying some with crows.
Yep.
And they're really pretty smart, right?
They are incredibly smart. They surprise me almost on a daily basis. They're incredibly fast learners, but also understand concepts. And here again, they are vertebrates, but they are only very remotely related to us on the phylogenetic tree. So the last common ancestor between us and the birds lived about 320 million years ago. That's an eternity in evolutionary times. The fascinating aspect about them is they are extremely intelligent, like many primates, but they have a very different end brain design. And instead of a cerebral cortex, a layered cerebral cortex, that is the intelligence center in our brain, where we also find numerical representations, they have more nuclear organized end brains. But many of the areas are equivalent in terms of the function and the functionality. And one of the areas that is particularly interesting for us is called nidopallium caudolaterale, which is thought to be the equivalent of our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex in primate is thought to be operating at the apex of this entire cortical hierarchy. That's what's also, as humans, is determining the personality of us humans, and it's what's making us smart and intelligent. And birds have a very similar area that evolved completely independently and is also sitting at the back of the head and not at the front as our prefrontal cortex. And for us as biologists, this is now an ideal case to ask the question, irrespective of the precise anatomical realizations of the brain, what are the general mechanisms that make any vertebrate smart, and in this case, or make any vertebrate able to process and crunch numbers? That's one of the reasons why we have started to work with crows many years ago.
I can't resist bringing up the issue of reptiles. This number sense has been demonstrated in everything except reptiles. I have the feeling that it's just lack of effort, but do you have any comments on that?
Yes. So I think I expressed my opinion while writing the book, and I finalized it, I think, half a year or 2 years ago. And at that time, there were 2 studies available, and both studies failed to show this numerical competence in reptiles. In the meantime, there's another study, a new study, that finally found that also reptiles, turtles in this case, can discriminate the number of objects. So full satisfaction for the reptiles. They belong to the other members of the vertebrates that manage numbers and can discriminate numbers, at least in a very rudimentary way.
So what are the key features of the approximate number system?
The key features there, I have to start probably with mentioning that many people think there are 2 different representational systems at work. So cognitive systems that allow us to represent numbers without symbols. One is called the object tracking system. And this object tracking system only works for a very limited small number of items. So it is said that it can represent 1 to at most 4 items. So it's very limited, but maybe in a relatively precise way. I personally do not find this system realized in any animal that I've been working with, so I am a little uncertain what to make of this idea. The other system is called the Approximate number system. And I'm a huge fan of this system because I see it realized in all animals and humans that we have been investigating so far. So here, this is this ancient estimation system, if you like. It is representing all numerosities, so an infinite range of numerosities, but in a relatively imprecise, in an approximate way. That means that we can discriminate very small numbers precisely, or animals. So maybe animals can discriminate 2 from 3 easily, but they can't discriminate 9 dots from 10 dots. If you have a reference numerosity of 10 dots, then the numerical distance between these numerosities has to be increased systematically. It has to be increased more and more the higher the numerical values become. So there is this proportional relationship of discriminability that follows the so-called Weber law. That means that the higher the numerical values become, the larger the distances have to become in proportion for animals or us to discriminate them. This Weber signature is a defining signature of this system. And when we explore what neurons have to say about numerical information, we also find this kind of approximate representation in animals at the very least that also follows this Weber law and shows exactly the same signature. So I think there is a close, intimate relationship between these two systems at work in animals.
The other law, I'm not sure how you would pronounce, the logarithmic relationship. Would you talk about that?
Yes, that is captured with Fechner's law. Fechner is another German psychophysicist. And he discovered that this representation of numerical magnitude is, so the subjective sensation of number is proportional to the logarithmic of the objective stimulus magnitude. So relative to a given reference number, animals find it easier to discriminate small numbers, but more difficult to discriminate larger numbers. And maybe I can give an example. So if an animal would just be able to discriminate the smaller number 8 from 10, it would not be able to discriminate 12 from 10, but it would only be able to discriminate 13 from 10 as an instance, even though in both cases the numerical distance is 2. So there is this asymmetry or a nonlinearity, I think that's a better way. The nonlinearity in how animals and we, without symbols, represent numerosity. There is this logarithmic number line at work.
The reason I wanted to emphasize this is it keys into the idea that this approximate number system is in some way perceptual-like, because the way we detect sound follows the same rule, right?
That's exactly right. So originally this law, the Weber and the Fechner law, they have been established for sensory intensities, very basic perceptual intensities. And the surprising aspect here is that we find exactly the same laws represented also for these very abstract magnitudes such as numerosities. We can even see this in children before they start to learn in school to represent numbers on a linear number scale, that they are representing numbers on a logarithmically compressed scale. So this seems to be the ancient way of how we subjectively represent numbers. And then only later with education, we get used to this linear number line that we use for coordinate systems and so on.
Yeah, you have a great figure in the book that shows the young child, and then as they get older, it gets linear, goes from being logarithmic to being linear. I think it's a fantastic demonstration of this principle.
Because it is perceptual-like, it's also very intuitive. And that's probably also why many animals have it. their brains are spontaneously able to represent at least approximately these numerical magnitudes. And I would even go so far as to say that it is probably an innate capability, both of our brain and of many animals' brain. It's, of course, always difficult to say that something is innate before you have done all the possible controls. But based on the literature that we have, for instance, that newborns at the age of 50 hours that have been tested right in the hospital where they have been born, even they can already discriminate the number of events, even across modalities. The newly hatched chicks can immediately discriminate numerosities. We have been doing experiments that showed that we don't have to train monkeys. And even in the untrained, numerically naive monkeys, we find neurons that are responding to numerical information. So I think there is lots of evidence that strongly suggests that there is this capability somehow innately wired into our brain. And then it sits there and waits. With education, it can transcend to a much higher system, different in quality, as soon as we learn number symbols.
And before we talk about that, I want to just spend a little bit more time talking about the difference between doing experiments in humans and in non-humans, including the reason why you need both.
At the end of the day, we are all interested in how our brain and how humans do it. But there are many methods and approaches that are not possible in humans. And that's why we have animal models, as we sometimes say, to investigate these capabilities. I think this is one of the reasons. And a second reason, also particularly from a biological point of view, if we transcend our anthropocentric viewpoint for a moment, we want to understand why numerical competence is so widespread in the animal kingdom. And the reason why it is so widespread has to be that it has a so-called adaptive value. It is good, or it is beneficial for survival of the individual and for reproducing. These are the core ideas of the theory of evolution, and why we think that certain traits, and here I'm including cognitive traits such as numerical competence, are present in the first place. So I think these are the two main reasons why investigating animals is helpful and beneficial.
Yeah, when I was telling somebody that I was going to interview you, I didn't find it difficult to explain this, because I was just like, if you were an animal with a bunch of other animals, you'd want to know whether you were outnumbered.
Yes. So there are many situations in the everyday life of an animal in its so-called ecological environment, so outside of a lab space, where numerical information is beneficial. One, for instance, is finding food. It's obvious that more food items are more nutritious, so animals should go for more food items, and that's what they're usually doing. I previously mentioned the example of the bees that are navigating by landmarks, and here again it is beneficial to be able to trace the number of landmarks. There are many other situations, such as in predation situations, animals try to avoid the risk of becoming prey by hiding among large groups of conspecifics. So fish do this, for instance, all the time. So here again, it is beneficial to discriminate the larger fish school from the smaller one. Or for predators, many of the predators have to team up into groups to be able to overpower their prey. And for wolves, for instance, it is known that they have optimal pack sizes for hunting preys of different dangerousness. They have about 6 wolves in their group when they hunt elks, but they need 8 for moose. And for bisons, the most formidable and dangerous prey that could kick them to death, they need between 10 and 13 wolves in such a pack. So there are lots of situations in the wild where it is known, or at least suspected, that numerical competence, the ability to deal with numbers, pays off and is of advantage for the animal.
I really found this approximate number system fascinating, partly because I'd never, ever even heard of it before. But I want to move on to the how do we get to the symbolic math? And I thought you might start by defining the difference between icons, indices, and symbols.
Okay. Yeah, icon, indices, and symbols are all what people call signs. So at some point in human history and in our development, there came the need to have a permanent record of numbers. There are different ways with increasing complexity to have such signs for numbers. And the icons, they would be characterized by a sensory relatedness with what has to be represented. A nice example would be tally sticks. So in tally sticks, we have these tallies, and every tally, every notch correlates with exactly one element of a set that has to be represented. So there is this perfect one-to-one correspondence, and therefore this sensory relationship between the sign and what has to be represented. For an index, it's a little more complex because here we have a temporal or a spatial correlation between the sign and what it has to represent. An alarm signal, for instance, is something that we learn is correlated with danger, or if we see clouds, then we learn that clouds mean rain, even though there is no sensory relationship between the rain and the word cloud or the sight of clouds. And then the third and most complex class of signs would be the symbol. And symbols are signs that are part of a combinatorial system, which means that they don't only have their own individual meaning, but the meaning is acquired by how these symbols are positioned in entire expressions. In language, for instance, it's a huge difference whether we say the cat chased the dog or the dog chased the cat, even though all three expressions, cat, dog, and the chasing, have exactly the same meaning, but the way we are structuring it gives the expression, the sentence, an entire different meaning. And it is very similar in arithmetic, in mathematics. Whether we say 2 minus 5 or 5 minus 2, the result is completely different, even though the individual symbols, the number symbols here, bear the same meaning. And that's a defining characteristic of a true symbol system. That's why I try to emphasize that this is something really very special in us humans. And I don't think, and I can't see based on the data that are around, that animals would be able to represent true symbols. They can learn for sure signs, icons, and indices, but I don't think they have the power to use them in a true symbol system.
Right. And you discuss this in great detail in the book, including several famous examples that have been used to claim the ability. In particular, Alex the parrot, which we don't have time to talk about, but just to mention to listeners that if you're interested in this issue, it's well discussed in the book. Brain Science is independently produced by me. So I want to take a moment to thank those of you who support the show financially. Your support remains critical, especially since I've cut back my hours at the VA so that I can devote more time both to creating great content and working on my new book, Why Neuroscience Matters. If you are new to the show or have just started wondering what you can do to help, I will remind you that there are three main options: a premium subscription, Patreon, and direct donations, including Venmo. The premium subscription gives you access to every episode created since 2006, as well as new episode transcripts. Patreon allows you to choose whatever monthly amount that fits your budget. My username on both Patreon and Venmo is Doc Artemis, DOCARTEMIS. To learn more about these choices, please visit brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. I understand a symbol in terms of numbers would include both the symbol for the number and this system. And an icon would be something like crosshatches for individual numbers. Could you give me an example of something that would be an index relative to numbers?
Maybe the ancient placeholders that were used in place value systems to indicate an empty column, something that later turned into the number 0.
But most of the examples where people have claimed that animals can do symbols, they're probably really just doing indices at the most.
That's what I think, yes. And the reason is that these representations are isolated from one another. They are not changed as a function of how they are being combined. And that, in my world, is a defining characteristic of a symbol and a symbol system. And I think we have two symbol systems. One is the language system, and the other one is number theory or mathematics.
So that gives us a good entry into the question of the relationship between numbers and language.
As I said previously, the intuitive thought, I guess, from everyone is that mathematics or counting is part of the language system. And probably the reason for this is that we all first learn to talk in life before we learn to count. But as these studies in patients, for instance, or also in healthy subjects indicate, there are really two different brain systems involved in representing linguistic properties or mathematical or number properties. So, for instance, patients that have specific lesions in certain areas, say in the parietal lobe, usually develop or sometimes develop a specific deficit in dealing with numbers or a specific deficit in calculating, while the language function is totally spared. I remember one patient, an Italian patient who had a brain damage, an infarct, and all of a sudden she was no longer able to represent numbers beyond 4, which was very, very weird, but still the language functions were preserved in this patient. And there are many studies like this. It's not always, and depending on the brain function that is affected, that the language and the number system are totally segregated. So sometimes both are affected depending on the brain areas. But the fact that there can be this double dissociation strongly argues that it is an independent system in the brain, at least in the adult brain. It may be different in the brain of children, juvenile brains, but at least in the adult brain, there is a clear dissociation.
So we know that reading changes our brain. So what happens when we learn mathematics? And I'm talking here now when we learn the symbolic math, not the kind that we're born with.
I think that is still the $1 million or $1 million question. It is really not understood what exactly is happening here. We have a lot of behavioral signatures, so all of a sudden we are able to represent numerical quantity very precisely and very exactly, and we can use these representations to do mathematics. We understand things like the successor functions, that numbers are an infinite succession of values. But what exactly is happening in the brain is really not well understood. I think many people, including me, would think that the basis, the fundament of this development comes with this approximate number system that is in place spontaneously, as I said earlier. But then something miraculous is happening that provides us with this precise and symbolic representation of numerical quantity. I think this is also one of the big questions for the future, and one that we hopefully might address at least partly with being able to investigate human patients and what's going on in their brain.
So could you take us through just kind of the general timing of what happens in a child?
The general timing would be that we all start out with this approximate estimation system, this approximate number system, as I called it. And this is in place, as I said earlier, right after birth. That helps us to discriminate the number of objects or the number of events. This seems to become a little more precise with age. but it will never become as precise as number symbols. And then around age 3, definitely before age 4, we start to become the subjects of a training protocol, usually done by our parents, that try to teach us how to count. So, for instance, counting the number of candies on the table, and if it's correct, then one gets the candies, and if not, then not. And what children then usually first do is they learn a sequence of words, like 1, 2, 3, 4. If you ask them again, okay, how many candies? They start all over again. 1, 2, 3, 4. They will always recite this list of words, which strongly indicates that at that point they have not yet understood that the number words are labels for a cardinality, because they could just say 4. That's what we would do. But they seem to use the number words at that point more like icons, as we said before, with a clear one-to-one correspondence. So every word corresponds to one object, one candy in this set of candies. And at the age of 4, then the true counting capabilities appear. And this is the stage where the children understand that they can simply go on with this sequence. They understand this successor function, that there are new words for every new instance. And they arrive at the point that they say, okay, this is the cardinality or the set size 4, without counting it all over again constantly. And then, of course, they also learn the rules of arithmetics and basic calculation rules much later in life, at around the age 6 or so, 7, the very demanding number 0, which is a latecomer both in human history and in our ontogenetic development. And then the system is a new quality of representation of numbers all of a sudden.
Okay, so besides those things, if a child is going to be able to do more math, is there any other big step that they have to make?
One of the other transitions that is quite well known is what we've been talking about earlier, that this is transition from a logarithmic number line to a linear number line. And that's certainly very important for all sorts of geometry and for representing the systems in coordinate systems, because here we always use linear systems. And of course, some of us become mathematical wizards, which needs, of course, a lot of training that can happen later in school and during our education. Maybe I should also mention the fascinating case of indigenous groups that have not been taught to use number symbols.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, which is also very revealing, because it tells us, again, this, if you like, primordial stage of numerical competence that we are in, if we are living in a culture where number symbols have not been invented and no one is teaching us to count. We tend to forget that we have to be taught. We tend to think that this is God-given, but it is not. It's a painful process early in life. So there are many fascinating studies by now from indigenous groups, for instance, in the Amazon region in Brazil, where anthropologists went into the jungle and investigated these people that have not developed in their culture number symbols and number words for whatever reason. But these people are, of course, totally healthy, totally fine. They just saw no use to develop number symbols. Some of them have what is called a one-to-many system, like the Piraha, which is one of these indigenous tribes. They have one word for one and another word for two, and these two words even sound almost identical. And then they have two words for many. That's all they have in their, if you even like to call it, counting system. When they are tested by anthropologists, they can discriminate 1 from 2, but for 3, they already make errors, and these errors continue and become more obvious for higher numbers, which is very characteristic of this approximate number system that we've been talking before in infants and in animals, and is again emphasizing that this system is there in our brain, probably innately. And if there's no one around to teach us anything better, if you like, then this is what we have. And that's what we have to get along with. And obviously these people do get along with it very well if they never saw the need to develop anything more precise.
I want to backtrack to the subject of the single neurons recordings, which right now you can mostly only do in animals. Would you tell us the main discovery about this regarding to numbers is?
Right. So the question is, how would single neurons, based on their electrical activity and based on the firing of the neurons, the number of action potentials per time, how would they represent cardinality or numerosity? That was the big question. And of course, in order to find out and to correlate what the neurons have to say, you need the animal in a very determined and controlled behavioral situation. That's why we are always controlling our animals, like monkeys, for instance, rhesus monkeys, in a computer-controlled task to work with numerosities. One of our standard tasks that almost all of the animals learn is a so-called delayed match to numerosity task. It's a version of a delayed match to sample task, which simply means that the animals are presented with a specific number of items that they can see on a screen, and they have to memorize over a brief period. And then a second display is shown. And this second display, in 50% of the cases, shows the same number of dots. And then the animals are trained to respond by, for instance, releasing a lever to get a reward. And in the other 50%, the second display shows a smaller or a larger numerosity, a different numerosity. And then the animals have learned that they must not release a lever and they have to wait for a certain amount to later then get a reward. And with this behavioral protocol, we can really determine that the animals can discriminate numerosity and that they are in a very controlled situation. And while the animals are performing the tasks, we are recording from single units in specific areas of their brains and listen to what they have to say. And the big finding was that there are a certain proportion in the posterior parietal cortex and in the prefrontal cortex of these monkeys that are specifically reacting to specific numerosities. So for instance, there are certain neurons that have the highest firing rate, the highest response whenever 3 dots appear, irrespective of how these 3 dots are arranged, and even irrespective of whether we show them simultaneously or one after the other. So they are encoding the numerosity 3. And the adjacent numerosities, like 2 and 4 in this example, are less responded to, and the neuron almost doesn't respond at all to numerosities 1 and 5 in this example. So what these neurons show is what we call a tuning function. They are tuned to a specific preferred numerosity. And such neurons are then, of course, not only tuned to number 3, but different neurons are tuned to 2 and 1 and 5 and 6 and so on. And all of these neurons together, based on their tuning, can represent the entire numerical space, or the number line, if you like, and thus informing the monkey about which number has been shown and has to be memorized to solve the task.
What do you do to prove that this is really a relationship between what these neurons are doing and what the monkey does?
Right, that's an excellent question, because the recording alone can only give us a correlation, and correlation is not a causal relationship. But there are ways around. So one way that I personally like a lot is to investigate what is happening when the monkeys are making an error. The assumption is that the monkeys make errors because the neurons behave differently or weren't able to encode their beloved or preferred numerosity. And this is in fact what we see. So when the animals make errors in these tasks, the neurons are not responding as much to their preferred numerosity, but show a lower activity. And this is the reason then, I think, why the animals make errors or become prone to errors. A more direct way would be to use other methods to change the properties of the neurons and see whether this has predicted effects on the monkey's behavior. And in one very nice study from a Japanese group, temporarily inactivated neurons in a spot in the parietal lobe where number neurons have been found. And so if you inactivate these neurons, you would assume that this should have consequences for the monkey in enumerating the number of objects, or in this case, it was the number of hand movements. And sure enough, this is exactly what happened. And they also controlled for other types of movements to be sure that this is not generally disturbing all sorts of movements, but it was really specific to the number of movements. And that's a very reassuring evidence that these neurons are really causally related to the capability to crunch numbers.
Andreas, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we could keep on talking for a long time, but we're just about out of time. You mentioned one of the important unanswered questions, which is exactly what happens in our brain when we learn mathematics. Are there any other big questions you're working on?
So one of the big questions for me is what is happening in the human brain for this non-symbolic number representation versus the symbolic number representation. This is something we can address in the future by continuing to working with patients, and that's why I'm very excited about this collaboration with the clinic in Bonn, at the University of Bonn. For us now, we kind of understand how this abstract categories, numerosity, are represented in the brain, but now the big question is, what is happening with this information in the brain? Because it is not an advantage to simply know what category is there. It is usually processed, and animals process it to make intelligent decisions about their everyday life. We process numbers when we calculate and do mathematics. So we are now using these categories, numbers, as an access point to understand what is happening when we keep these numbers in our working memory, in our mental sketchpad, when we process this information online in our mind, when we follow numerical rules, when we make decisions based on numerical information. So these are these functions or capabilities that are usually summarized as cognitive control functions or executive functions. And I think numbers here are an ideal access point to understand these functions, precisely because numbers have to use all of these high-level cognitive functions, and they have to be processed in the brain. So I think this will be the next maybe 20 years of what we are doing in our lab.
Yeah, you won't run out of stuff to do before you retire.
Probably not.
So what's the most important idea that you would like my listeners to take away from our conversation?
I think the most important idea conveyed in the book is that there is something present in our brain that helps us to represent numerical information even before we learn to count properly. And that it is worthwhile to understand this system because it is the first building block of everything that comes later, even up to mathematics. And I'm very convinced that the properties and features of this non-symbolic number sense influence very much also our symbolic mathematical capabilities.
If we knew more, we would be able to predict who's going to have trouble learning math.
Exactly. And we would better understand what goes wrong when something happens in the brain. And even to the point, and some people are actively working about this, to help people who have problems with mathematics because of learning deficits, to better deal with numbers and to better be able to calculate, because it turns out that not being able to process numbers is at least as detrimental for everyday life as not being able to read or write. So there's a huge need in terms of educational devices or strategy to help people or students or pupils in school that suffer from such deficits to better deal with them.
Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close?
I guess we covered a lot of ground.
Do you have any advice for students that might be interested in getting into this field?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think if someone wants to study neuroscience, then I would recommend some biologically oriented science or discipline to study, such as biology or medicine or maybe biophysics. And what is very obvious, at least for this kind of systems neuroscience that I stand for, is that a strong quantitative background So here we are again with numbers and mathematics is extremely important and is unavoidable. In general, I would recommend to start out broadly, maybe have an open mind and find a topic that truly inspires one, which I find is often a problem for students. So I often speak to students and they can't make up their mind what is really the topic that they are most interested in. I think this is very important. I would not study too long, probably, and move on to the next respective career stages, because it turns out that the greatest and most valuable contributions are made by junior scientists, particularly neuroscience, particularly when working with behaving subjects, animals in particular. It pays off to have tenacity and endurance and being ready to stay for maybe a few years somewhere to get something done in a very productive way.
When you reached out to Dr. Miller to work in his lab, you knew his work because you were keeping up with the literature. The reason I ask is because I get a lot of emails from people asking me how they can find somebody to study under. It seems to me like that would be the first step.
Yes, I think reading and getting to know the field is extremely important. Yes, so to answer your question, I knew the brilliant work of Earl Miller in this realm of executive functions and prefrontal functions. That's exactly why I addressed him, and I was very happy then to work under his supervision. So I think to get this kind of information to make up one's mind is very, very important. How else should you know what is really the topic that you want to spend your life on? And I think it was never as easy as today to go into the internet and find this sort of information. I also do think, besides being ready to go the extra mile and being ready to be productive, it is important to go somewhere where the environment can be instrumental in fostering the development. In other words, I would look around to exactly find the laboratory that provides the best opportunity for someone to really become educated in a specific field of area. You can be as smart as you want. If the environment is not okay and you are in the wrong laboratory, that is not very helpful. So it takes at least these two aspects. The subject itself has to be able to contribute, but you also need the appropriate input.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to discuss that. Besides your book, where can my listeners learn more about your work?
Visiting my webpage, there you will find all the literature that we've been published.
And I can definitely link to your webpage in my show notes.
Or if it's very specific, of course, people would find my email and could drop me a line.
Good. Yeah, I like for people to take the time to go to someone's website. I never give out emails because I feel like if a person is too lazy to go to the researcher's website themselves, that's kind of a screen in my mind.
Right. So then I would really recommend my webpage, because there's really all the literature we have been publishing, from original research to reviews. You will find different sorts of papers.
Yeah, that's what most people are doing now, is they're putting that stuff up on their website so that students and others can find it. So that's why I get annoyed when somebody writes to me as if I should do their research for them.
Yeah. That's a fine line. Yes.
That's not a good sign, really.
I understand.
Yeah. Okay, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
It was really a privilege for having me here. I really enjoyed it.
I want to thank Andreas Nieder for taking the time to talk with me about his fascinating book, A Brain for Numbers, The Biology of the Number Instinct. This book provides an up-to-date review of the scientific evidence for numerosity across many species. It's intended for students and scientists, but will reward anyone who reads it. I personally enjoyed learning that humans appear to share an approximate number system with the rest of the animal kingdom. What does this mean? It does not mean that animals can count. Counting is a hard-earned symbolic skill that human children acquire around the age of 4, but only if they are taught. But Dr. Nieder emphasized that the most important idea in his book is that even before we learn to count, our brain has the ability to represent numerical information. even honeybees can tell the difference between different numbers of objects. We didn't talk about this in great detail, but the approximate number system has two key features that guide scientists when they're testing new species. It follows two laws, which I'm going to spell out to allow for different pronunciations. The first is Weber's law. That's spelled W-E-B-E-R. This is the so-called distance effect, which says that the higher the numerical values are, the larger the distance between them has to be to detect the difference. So it's easy to tell the difference between 1 and 2, but not so easy to tell the difference between 99 and 100, for example. And then there's Fechner's law, F-E-C-H-N-E-R. This is the law that says that the subjective sensation of a number is proportional to the logarithm of the objective stimulus magnitude. This law also applies to sound. That's the reason why sound is measured in decibels. That's a logarithmic thing. So without getting too technical, I want to emphasize a few points. Both of these laws were originally established for sensory intensities, such as sound. These are both nonlinear phenomena compared to the linear number line that we learn when we learn to count. We talked quite a bit about how this kind of numerosity is present in many diverse species. But one key idea is that the tests have been done in newborn animals and humans, which demonstrates that this really is a cognitive instinct rather than learned. I refer you back to episode 168, where Cecilia Hayes explained the difference between cognitive instincts and cognitive gadgets, which are learned. One thing we didn't talk about was the fact that numerosity is an example of convergent evolution because it's actually emerged several times, no doubt because it provides a huge survival advantage. I'm not going to go back through the examples that Dr. Nieder shared, but I do want to review the distinction between icons, indices, and symbols, because this distinction is important for understanding the difference between the non-symbolic approximate number system, which appears to be almost universal, and symbolic mathematics, which appears to be unique to humans. Nieder noted that indices and symbols are both signs, as opposed to icons, which are characterized by a sensory relatedness to what is being represented. So an example of an icon would be a tally stick, where every notch represents one of something. An index is a little bit more complex. It usually involves a temporal relationship to whatever's being represented. So, for example, a certain kind of warning cry might represent a particular kind of danger. Another example, a cloud, is an index of possible rain. Symbols are more complex and generally are part of a combinatorial system so that they lack intrinsic meaning on their own. For example, letters have to be combined into words, and in most languages, changing the word order changes the meaning. Thus, mathematics is symbolic because 5 minus 2 is different from 2 minus 5. We discussed Nieder's opinion that animal abilities do not extend into this symbolic realm, even though there are several examples of indices, such as the famous vervet monkey's alarm cries. Nieder said, the reason is that these representations are isolated from one another. They are not changed as a function of how they are being combined. He called this a defining characteristic of a symbol and a symbol system. Now remember that language and counting are different systems in the brain. We learn to talk before we learn to count symbolically. But remember, we are born with that approximate number system. Nieder commented that we have not yet learned exactly what's going on in the brain when we learn mathematics. We start out with the same basic numerosity of other animals, and then when we learn to count, it seems to emerge rather suddenly when the child grasps that idea of succession, or n plus 1. And this usually occurs around the age of 4. This idea of n+1 is a concept that animals never seem to grasp. After we learn to count, we gradually learn other rules like addition and subtraction. And he pointed out that 0, which came very late in human history, is also a demanding concept that people learn later on. Now, another interesting part of this discussion was about single neuron recordings, because these are usually done in animals. And the example we talked about was the ones that have been done in monkeys that show that single neurons are tuned to specific numerosities. The way they're tuned resembles the way they respond to other sensory stimuli, and that includes following Weber's and Fechner's laws. Interestingly, when the monkeys make errors, the neurons don't fire as expected. This implies a causal relationship between these neurons and numerical behavior or competence. I want to end this brief review by returning to what Dr. Nieder said near the end of the interview. The key idea in A Brain for Numbers is that before we learn to count, our brain has the ability to represent numerical information. It is important to understand how this system works because it's the first building block of everything that comes later, even up to mathematics. Nieder is convinced that the properties and features of this non-symbolic number sense also influence our symbolic mathematical capabilities. So if we could understand what's going on in the brain, we might be able to help those that are having trouble learning math, because actually not being able to do math is as detrimental to everyday life as not being able to read or write. I'd love to hear your feedback on this episode. As always, you can find the complete show notes and episode transcript at brainsciencepodcast.com. You can send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com or submit voice feedback via speakpipe.com/DocArtemis. You can also post to the Brain Science Podcast fan page on Facebook. And I'd really like to encourage you to join and post to our Goodreads group, which you can get to via the shortcut brainscienceforum.com. The most important announcement that I need to share before I close is that starting in April 2020, Brain Science will be going back to once a month. The main reason for this change is so that I can continue to create high-quality content while I'm writing my book, Why Neuroscience Matters, which I hope to release by the end of the year. I also continue to work as a physician at the VA hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, so I'm trying to be realistic about my time management. Meanwhile, I am hoping to release the expanded edition of Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty in early May. It doesn't look like I'm going to meet my original target date of April 28th, but given the current uncertainty, I highly recommend signing up for the free Brain Science newsletter, so I'll be able to get you updated information in between episodes. To get the newsletter, just go to brainsciencepodcast.com and look for the newsletter link. I don't expect to make much money from Are You Sure? But I am hoping to generate sufficient sales in the first couple of weeks to make the top of the neuroscience list on Amazon. Anyone who buys the book in the first 2 weeks after release will be invited to a special webinar later this spring. I'll share more details about this next month. Until next month, I hope you will check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Graying Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Brain Science is copyright 2020 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You can share this audio with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mind Fire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.